Good afternoon, everyone. We're just talking about how the time is different on the wall and on the computer and on the phone, but it's about 4 o'clock. So let's get started. Today, I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Watson right here. Nobody giggles. I thought it was hilarious. In a cool way. Sherlock Holmes. Well, Sherlock is not here. So we got Dr. Watson.
I can never be that cool. Yeah.
She is from, and I have to read this. This is a mouthful. The Rinker Senior School of Construction Management and the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies here at UF, which is basically across the road over there. She joined UF last fall, just like me, and her research focuses on disaster recovery of businesses and households and how recovery policies can be structured to better meet community needs. And she has degrees in urban planning from Ohio State and Texas A&M. And today she's going to talk about all kinds of impacts of Hurricane Harvey. That's a long title, so
sorry.
Impacts of Hurricane Harvey. We're looking forward to hear about that.
Thank you. All right. Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all. This is such a nice group, and glad that it's such an active colloquium series. And yeah, so happy to see you. And thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I'm just across the street over in the Rinker School. And yeah, even though I'm in construction management, you know, most of my work is with the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. And so the Schimberg Center is a research center, but also is a very practice-oriented center. So we provide a lot of data for the state of Florida in terms of planning for housing and providing affordable housing information. We just finished a rental market study just this year to look at some of the rental needs across the state of Florida. Anne Ray did that. She's wonderful. But yeah, today I'm not going to talk about housing. I'm actually going to be talking about businesses. But maybe more accurately, what I do want to talk about is why we can't really talk about housing recovery without talking about business recovery and vice versa. So those two processes are very tightly linked, both kind of conceptually as well as spatially, which is kind of why I wanted to talk to you guys about this. And so the more that we can take advantage of those relationships, I think the better off we're going to be in terms of planning. And so my position, and you know, maybe you'll feel the same, maybe you won't after I'm done, but I think we need to think about both of these things together when planning for disaster recovery, specifically when we're planning for equitable disaster recovery. So the picture on the right and what was kind of on the background of the title slide is of Hurricane Laura. So Hurricane Laura was a Category 4 hurricane that is still currently tied as the strongest hurricane on record to make landfall in the state of Louisiana. And so you can actually see, and you know, I am going to talk about Texas too. Actually, the eye kind of went right over that Texas-Louisiana border, but we know that kind of this side of the hurricane tends to be a little bit stronger. So it was very strong for Louisiana compared to Texas. Yeah, and so I did title my talk about Hurricane Laura and some of that work. Some of the work going on in Southeast Texas and Southwest Louisiana with colleagues at Texas A&M, but I also wanted to spend some time talking about how we ended up there and kind of why we're asking these questions and why we're asking these questions in that context. So, you know, in true talk, I sort of went a little bit all over the place. So I hope you can follow me, and we'll get there in the end about equitable recovery. So I'll go over some of the background, some of the theory, some of the previous work that's gone on with other events, especially in Texas. And then, yeah, I'll talk about Laura and some of the implications that overall story has for equitable disaster planning. So yeah, very excited to talk with you all about this. So probably a lot of you know this or have seen this before, but I'll talk about it a little bit again, that the academic literature is constantly growing in its evidence that disasters exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. And some might argue that disasters aren't necessarily, you know, physical phenomena, but actually, you know, just accelerating some of these things are already happening in the community. And so we see this is just a conceptualization from Dr. Peacock, Dr. Van Zandt, Dr. Zhang, and Dr. Highfield at Texas A&M, and Texas A&M Galveston, Virginia Tech. They were all at Texas A&M. But so they had this diagram to kind of show what that might look like, where disasters, we have these kind of pre-existing, sorry, you guys can't see that. Here we go. we have our pre-existing inequalities that have occurred before the disaster happened. So we might have differences in the physical infrastructure in terms of where we're investing our public dollars, or where we're putting our affordable housing, which may not get repaired as often. So we're seeing differences in infrastructure spatially and across these levels of vulnerability. We may see pre-existing inequalities in terms of resource access. So we've had histories of discriminatory lending, we've had histories of redlining, which have contributed to the spatial and also resource inequalities that we see before a disaster. And then when a disaster strikes, we see that just get magnified. So we see for kind of low income or marginalized groups who tend to be in the recovery period for longer. They tend to have less access to recovery resources. So starting out maybe in a position where there's fewer resources and then not able to qualify for some of the federal disaster assistance, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And then, all of that can culminate into some long-term wealth inequalities that can occur after a disaster happens. And so, this is getting repeated time and time again, but just as kind of a recap. But the good news is federal agencies have started to take notice of this phenomenon, and especially the role that disaster assistance does play in that process. So that role of resource access in exacerbating these kind of pre-existing societal inequalities. And so this has prompted FEMA to very recently emphasize equity in their disaster aid process. So I'll kind of put some of these up here, very recent articles and statements made by FEMA and other agencies. In 2020, the most recent National Advisory Council report to the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, specifically calls for an emphasis on equity in allocating post-disaster aid. And they cite that specifically people, municipalities, tribes, and states with relatively more resources can access the most program assistance, which was kind of impressive that that was in their report. And so then that actually became in their strategic plan. So this one here, sorry, so many screens. This bottom one, this goals and objective, that's pulled straight from FEMA's strategic plan between 2022 and 2026, so very recent. And the goal here is to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. And so under that goal, you can see that goal 1.3 is specifically looking at achieving equitable outcomes for those we serve, and specifically direct resources to eliminate disparities in disaster outcomes. So FEMA's role tends to be primarily to serve homeowners and renters. But in April of this year, also, you can see in the upper right that SBA, which is the US Small Business Administration, also released an equity action plan focused specifically on businesses and the assistance that they provide through the Small Business Administration. And so they're committing to improve access to resources for not just households that FEMA is committing to, but also businesses owned by entrepreneurs who identify with communities that have been traditionally underserved. And so their fourth action item that I cropped and kind of put on there focuses again on disaster assistance specifically. So this idea of equity and disaster assistance is kind of very much in the public debate currently. Even within this last year, a lot of things are happening. And so I want to talk about, now that we've seen this SBA kind of getting on board with this, what equity has to do with businesses. So that social vulnerability perspective, that framework that I showed in kind of 2 slides ago, that's usually applied to households. In fact, that paper that had that figure in it was looking at housing recovery and applied to housing specifically. And so why and should the Small Business Administration focus on equitable outcomes when, as a business organization might be more pressured to look strictly at economic metrics, or maybe be a little bit more, behaving in a completely free market way. But I'm, not an economist or a political scientist, so I'm going to actually talk about this from my perspective as an urban planner. And I think a lot of this kind of equity discussion has to do with the second discussion, or the second question that I have here, of, maybe it's not how we think about it as just equitable business recovery in terms of the individuals within the business who run, manage, and shop at businesses, but also what I was saying earlier about how business recovery fits into the context of overall community recovery and what the role businesses play in that process. And I think I want to start that conversation by arguing, again, from my perspective as an urban planner, that I don't necessarily see businesses as purely economic units, but also social units and play a role socially in our communities. So we know that in rural communities where businesses are more tied to the community and more invested in community, they have higher levels of social capital, and those communities tend to have more amenities and higher quality of life compared to other communities. And many small businesses, such as boutiques and bars and cafes, provide goods and services, as well as a meeting space or some of these kind of third places that we use that aren't necessarily fully public or fully private, but a place that, you know, we can hang out. I don't know, when I was younger, it was like Barnes and Noble. I don't know what it is for, you know, kids these days, but, you know, it's a place where you can hang out with your friends, and, you know, as you're a teenager, you don't, you know, have too many places to go. So, you know, sometimes businesses play that role. And also in my own research, after, you know, several disaster events, Hurricane Florence, I'll talk about in North Carolina, you know, businesses tend to also behave like social units. Like, we think of them theoretically that way, and we kind of use them that way. But, you know, as individuals, business owners are making decisions not purely maximizing profit, but also because, you know, they want to be by family, they want to serve their community. And in recovery, they often make decisions that are helping in the overall recovery process. So some examples that I've come across are, you know, they've provided, you know, I don't know, transportation for their employees. They've, you know, done all kinds of kind of, I don't know, philanthropic activities, or served as resource hubs for donations, all kinds of things. And so it's kind of this, idea that they're, like the economic as well as the social units within our community, and providing a service in recovery as well. And so because we can start thinking about businesses as social units, we can start to see how that idea of social vulnerability might relate to businesses. And so business owners or managers that belong to maybe a historically marginalized group, low-income group, or a racial minority group, actually have, roles as household members that are kind of the labor input to businesses. And I hate to describe it that way, but people work at businesses. They might belong to a group that might be facing greater difficulties during recovery. Customers might also be, have more difficulty in recovery. They may not have the goods, or sorry, the resources to, shop at particular businesses, depending on, the market area of the business. The business owner themselves might have difficulty accessing post-disaster aid. They might be, struggling with more severe personal home damage because of this infrastructure disparity that we might see in disasters. And that's kind of why I have this infrastructure as a dotted piece. But there are a lot of applications in my mind that we can apply some of the social vulnerability ideas to the way that we conceptualize businesses as part of our overall community as a whole. Okay, and so I was able to kind of start looking at this in a project that we're doing in Lumberton, North Carolina, after Hurricane Florence. And so this is research through the Center for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning. It's a mouthful. It's at Colorado State University. It's a very large center. Engineers, social scientists, economists, which technically are social scientists, but a big group of people looking at this one small community called Lumberton in North Carolina. It's a majority minority community. So you can see the, interesting split between non-Hispanic Black population, non-Hispanic white population, and then a fairly large community of Lumbee Indian tribe members in Lumberton, North Carolina. And so we've been going to North Carolina in Lumberton every year-ish. You can see the pandemic kind of messed us up once, but ever since 2016, kind of following how this community has recovered from not just Hurricane Matthew, but also Hurricane Florence in the pandemic. And I kind of wanted to use the Lumberton case for some of my work to try to test some of the relationships that we saw in that overall community model from the Lindell paper. And so we saw, I guess I'll back up a little bit. So how we structured this field study is, we tried to do our samples in a way that we were able to look at the interdependencies between all of these, housing units, infrastructure units, and business units. So we started with the school zone because we kind of saw that as a kind of unit of I don't know, social cohesion in a way. Then we drew our housing samples, and then we drew our business samples as a relation to our housing samples, because we wanted to see, how does, housing damage, housing dislocation then affect business interruption? How does business interruption then affect employee retention, the ability of people to return to their jobs, and then the long-term recovery of all of those units. And so this paper actually that we wrote first test this through kind of Bayesian methods. I'm not going to put it up there because they're very complicated looking slides. It's not my expertise, but my co-author's expertise. But we did find some pretty interesting relationships between these different categories. So revenue recovery, for example, was related to number of employees in terms of housing units there. But businesses themselves were more likely to return to their previous level of revenue if they had more employees. So larger businesses were able to, employ people and return to their revenue kind of level after the disaster. And then in turn, business interruption, so how long the business was closed after a disaster, did relate to whether or not the business was able to retain their employees. And those were all significant findings, statistically. So there were a lot of very strong interactions between the business recovery, the ability to support housing recovery, and the ability to maintain employment and maintain services. And customer loss was interesting, I think, because we were able to look at it a little bit more spatially. And so we found a few things. So we used 4 different methods to try to account for the effect of households on an individual business unit. So these are all kind of businesses and households in here. It's kind of hard to tell without the size, but we used 4 different methods. We used just a simple radius method, trying to capture, households within the general like walking distance radius or travel distance radius within, the area of the business. We did a K method. We tried to look at, the number of houses around the business and how those houses were recovering. And then we tried to account for a downtown effect. So Lumberton does have a downtown area, and so we assume that downtown businesses are going to have a larger market area. So we allowed for the radius to get larger with the downtown effect, as well as the number of households that we're pulling from to also be greater for the downtown effect. And we actually found, so we're not just looking at, whether the housing was back or not, but we also looked at housing recovery in terms of damage, vacancy status, income in the nearby housing units, and made a little index of that. With these 4 types of spatial weighting. And we did find that the higher the average damage of housing units within a radius of 0.7 kilometers, that's for the non-downtown businesses, and 2.5 kilometers for downtown businesses, the lower the customer retention rate was for the business. So there was a spatial relationship between the business's ability to recover and the housing recovery surrounding that business. And this actually extends some previous findings from Yu Zhao and Shannon Van Zandt back in 2012, who did kind of a similar thing in Galveston after Hurricane Ike, and found that housing return affected business return, just kind of that binary metric, within a 0.8 kilometer radius, which is very similar. So 0.1 kilometers larger than ours. And so, yeah, we find that customer retention then kind of on this right-hand side is really important for the long-term recovery of the business. So this is kind of the end result of that paper. And then this is kind of a new one that we were looking at, where so 15 months after the event, this was a very kind of short-term metric. So the interruption is kind of within a couple weeks, a couple days. But then long-term, 15 months later, when we're coming back, I don't have that timeline, but in that wave 2, when we came back to see how the business was doing, customer loss was one of the most important factors for businesses in that long-term recovery. So you can see that even a 50%, even a 10% loss of customers led to the probability of a business being fully recovered at that 15-month mark as only around 50%. So it was a very important factor for businesses, holding a bunch of other covariates at their means. This is that full model. So businesses that lost customers were less likely to be fully recovered after 15 months. But another thing that we found, well, yes, smaller businesses were less likely to be fully recovered after 15 months. That's something that is in the literature pretty consistently in terms of level of resources for businesses. But we also found that businesses owned or managed by a racial or ethnic minority were also less likely to be fully recovered after 15 months, controlling for those other factors. So this was kind of the first time that I ended up finding some of that social vulnerability piece in our business recovery models in terms of the ownership of the business. Okay, so that's the Lumberton study. And so we know that the FEMA and SBA are now getting really interested in the role of disaster assistance in equity. But before we even start talking about equity and start talking about equity and disaster assistance, we kind of have to know if the disaster assistance works in the first place. And we also have to know what, in this case, what businesses are actually getting these assistance in the first place. And so that's another study that I did at Texas A&M. I looked into the SBA disaster loan program. And so the SBA disaster loan program, even though I've been talking about it with respect to businesses, they're also a pretty significant housing assistance provider. And so I don't have it up there, but they're actually one of the larger housing assistance providers, aside from like CDBG-DR, which happens a lot later in the process, like 2 to 3 years after the process. That's a whole nother talk. But yeah, the SBA disaster loan program is a very large assistance program. They offer loan-based assistance, which is why they can offer a lot more size of money. And so for businesses, they can get physical disaster loans where they can use that funds for repairing their physical structure, or they can get an economic injury loan, which is kind of trying to repair the working capital or kind of revenue loss that we saw was really important with the loss of customers. But kind of on the bottom here, this is actually what got me interested in getting a PhD in the first place. I did my thesis on business recovery after Hurricane Ike in 2013. And so these are some of the things that businesses told me in 2013 about this disaster assistance process. So all extremely negative, very difficult and cumbersome, very annoying, burdensome. Paperwork is just too much. And maybe my favorite, the higher the level of government, the biggest the waste of time. They did not hold back on the disaster loan program. So I was really interested in knowing, all right, well, if we're gonna be advocating for, having this assistance be available, we should know whether or not it's effective. And so to do that, I did a case control matching study where I matched businesses in Galveston County that were impacted by Hurricane Ike that received a loan from the SBA and matched them with as close of a business similar to them that I could find. So kind of similar to, what we might find in, an actual experimental design, but, we have to do it after the fact. So, I have to match it on things like sector, ownership, size, damage, anything that the literature had said that would affect a business's ability to get a loan. So we've got the business that was approved for a loan paired with a very similar business that wasn't approved for a loan to see if their survival probabilities after 7 years were improved. And so that was kind of this matched piece, right? So that's that matched sample. But kind of the bonus piece was I actually got from the SBA their full list of every business that had ever gotten a loan from Galveston in terms of Hurricane Ike. So I wanted to see too, since I had the data, which businesses were able to get more money and what characteristics of the loan led to businesses getting more money, as well as did businesses, once approved, decide they even wanted the loan, which is actually, you would think that businesses might always take the loan, but there's literature out there that says that, and it kind of has to do with this kind of small business versus larger business thing, but, it is loan-based assistance. And so you do have to pay it back. Even if it is low interest, it's still putting a debt burden on the recipient of that loan. And so it matters for households in terms of that additional debt that they're taking on. But, it also matters for businesses because, especially if you're extremely damaged, you're not bringing in revenue, you're still trying to pay your employees, do your payroll. And so are you also going to add even a low interest loan onto that additional debt burden? And so, it's possible that businesses might be really sensitive to that. So we'll get to that. And so this is a conditional logistic regression, which is basically instead of looking at the full pool of the match sample, it's kind of comparing between those two units. So the business that received a loan and their kind of counterpart, their controlled counterpart. and looking at what are the differences between, all of those individual groups. And so the things that I matched on won't show up in this because they'll be kind of, I don't know, crossed out, or I forget the word. They cancel each other out. That's what I'm trying to say. And so we'll see kind of the things that vary between them show up, but we don't expect them to be significant other than this treatment variable, which is why we kind of do the matching method in the first place. And so we do see that businesses that did receive a loan from SBA benefited. They did have odds of survival that were 2.5 times higher than a similar business that didn't receive a loan. But this was kind of a side thing that I didn't expect to see. But we did also find that businesses that moved also had a higher odds of survival that were 3.9 times higher than a similar business that remained in their original location. So it was kind of interesting to me at the time because, as an urban planner, I'm always, trying to think that if we help businesses and, it's going to help the community, but actually it seems that it might be a better business decision to actually leave the disaster community rather than stay in it in terms of survival. And that has to do, again, back with that customer loss idea. So especially with Galveston, and, I'm going to bring it back to affordable housing because I work for a housing center, I have to. But, the more that we lose customers, the more that we lose housing, the market is going to change for businesses. And so a business might serve a particular market, and then, due to displacement, due to all of these, changes and inequalities that we see, they may not, be able to serve that same market anymore. And we see that in other studies, and I'll kind of show what that might mean for particular neighborhoods in a couple of slides here. All right, so that was the treatment group doing the match sample. This is just looking at all of the SBA properties, all the SBA loan businesses. And so this is just looking at who is actually benefiting from disaster assistance in terms of our business community, not necessarily in terms of our homes. I just pulled a few here just for us to look at, but what I found in terms of amount was that larger businesses were approved for more money. That makes some sense, especially with the repayment ability. They're a little bit of a more trustworthy applicant in the eyes of the SBA, because if they're larger, they have more resources. They're probably less likely to default on that loan. There's also the idea that larger businesses intersected with a flooding event are going to have more damages, so they probably need more funding. But we do control for damage. We also see that the higher the flood depths, also approved for more money. So that also makes sense in terms of the mission of the SBA. Longer loan terms were also associated with having more money. So you were able to get more funding if you were able to kind of incur that debt for longer, probably had smaller payments, but over a longer course of time. And I should mention that these loan terms can be up to 30 years. They're quite long. And they can also be, in terms of collateral, you can use your personal home property for these collaterals. So they're a big commitment occasionally. A few other things that I didn't necessarily highlight, but home businesses got a little bit less, likely because they're receiving other kind of home-based assistance. Older businesses were getting more. That's kind of similar to the resource with the larger businesses, but these are kind of the ones that I wanted to point out. But kind of the interesting thing, so we're also able to test that debt burden hypothesis. So do recipients of SBA loan programs actually react to this idea of a debt burden? So we can do a logistic regression, which looks at whether businesses ultimately take the loan after being approved for it. And so maybe counterintuitively, we did find that businesses with more damage were less likely to take loans. And so we think that it might be because that they are very wary of taking additional debt, taking assistance, when the damage might prevent them from running their business, operating with their full revenue. And so kind of counterintuitive to what we would think about disaster assistance, the more damage that occurred, the less likely that business was actually going to take that assistance. We also saw that larger businesses were more likely to take loans. So if we're thinking about which businesses that we want to remain in our communities, larger businesses aren't necessarily inherently bad, but a lot of these kind of social unit arguments that I was making about the businesses earlier do tend to fall with smaller businesses. So kind of our as we romantically think about mom and pop shops and some of these things. And so, yeah, again, with the debt burden thing, larger businesses are able to incur that debt a little bit more. They're more likely to take loans. And yeah, businesses with longer loan terms, even though it meant more assistance in kind of our previous, the longer loan terms also led businesses to decline the loan more frequently. So yeah, kind of the broad takeaway with this was that really the neediest businesses in terms of damage, in terms of available resources prior to the disaster, kind of when we're thinking about that magnification effect of that kind of vulnerability lens, neediest businesses might not necessarily be the ones benefiting from our current disaster assistance methods. The businesses that were benefiting, at least based on what we're seeing here, not maybe necessarily all over, were more likely to be resilient to begin with. And that does mirror what we see in the broader trends of the literature in terms of people with resources have an easier access to additional resources. In the case of SBA, the more resources you have, the more secure you are with collateral, the more secure you are in taking additional debt. And so you're more comfortable with taking on additional assistance, which might lead you to be more successful in the long term. So there might be this idea of a vicious cycle or even a virtuous cycle, depending on which one you end up on, where there's almost a recovery dichotomy that happens with businesses, where if you're a business that's damaged, you lose your revenue, and so you don't use disaster assistance because you're afraid you're not able to pay it back. Businesses that are less damaged can maintain their revenue, get assistance, and maybe be more benefited in the long term. So it's almost that initial decision point, which can lead to your initial level of damage, your ability to access resources, and ultimately your ability to recover in the long term. Okay, so I promise we'll get to Hurricane Laura. So I wanted to put all that up there because this is sort of where we were at before we decided to go into Louisiana and Texas. So here's what we know and what we don't know at this point. So we know that evidence exists for some disparate recoveries between minority-owned and non-minority-owned businesses based on the Lumberton example. We weren't, unfortunately, able to test that in the Galveston case. This is kind of an aside, but I don't know if anyone in here does business research, and I would love to talk to you if you do, but it's very, very difficult to get information on ownership of businesses, especially minority-owned businesses. Even if we wanted to plan for better recovery for minority-owned businesses, Latino-owned businesses or Black-owned businesses, that usually that information is very difficult to find. And so for the Galveston example, we know that businesses that are owned by minority groups tend to be smaller, and we know that smaller businesses tend to fare worse when it comes to this disaster assistance access. But we don't actually know whether there's some link between minority-owned businesses and resource access. So that's kind of the first piece there. But we also don't know really the mechanism behind why we're seeing disparate recovery between minority-owned businesses and non-minority-owned businesses. Maybe we have an idea that it may have to do with the neighborhood in terms of the recovery. So if we think that there's greater exposure for minority neighborhoods based on kind of our patterns of development, some of our unequal patterns of development, then we might suspect that might be why that there might be disparities. Maybe it's because of just the ability of the business owner themselves to access resources. We know that the neediest businesses, at least in the Galveston case, weren't the ones that were benefiting from disaster assistance. And we don't know whether that extends to different ownership characteristics like, minority-owned businesses versus not. And yeah, we know that businesses have spatial relationships with households, but, we just did a radius and we did the K method. But, we just did that based on the previous study. We have very little information on what business markets or business spatial extents of their supply chain actually look like. So we kind of have to guess and see where we find some of these relationships. But the more that we know about that spatial extent of that market, that customer range, the better we're going to be able to plan for some of these disruptions in the future. Okay, so Hurricane Laura. So this was 2020. I got a rapid grant to explore some of these kind of remaining questions in Lake Charles, Beaumont, and Port Arthur. And as you can see, Lake Charles, Beaumont, and Port Arthur have had a very tough time in terms of disasters. They had Hurricane Harvey, which was a super large event in Texas in 2017. They had Hurricane Laura in 2020. Hurricane Delta happened very quickly after. And so what ended up happening was the wind, Laura was a very wind heavy event. So that's why you see on the left here, it's a lot of wind damage to the roofs. And so a lot of people in Lake Charles, this is Lake Charles, lost their roof from Hurricane Laura. Hurricane Delta comes in, is a rain event, and just pours water into people's exposed homes because of the roof damage. And so it was kind of this really terrible 1-2 punch that happened in Lake Charles after these two hurricanes. We also had the winter freeze in 2021, which was really awful, speaking from having been there. And then we had inland flooding in Lake Charles also in 2021. So sort of just a rainfall, kind of our normal inland flooding type of event. And so, yeah, it's not just the outstanding questions, I guess, from the previous research, but also even thinking about that lens at that kind of beginning slide. How does that lens change or look differently when we're thinking about these types of compound events? So do we keep seeing that refraction over and over and over again? Probably, if we're to hypothesize. And so that's kind of what we were interested in here. What can we learn about the different linkages between, minority neighborhoods, minority communities, minority businesses, normal businesses? How does compound events play into that process? How is that creating additional widening gaps within our communities? And so, yeah, we got this grant in 2020. It's in collaboration with Dr. Michelle Meyer at Texas A&M, Joy Simeon, who's a really wonderful PhD student there. A lot of this work is going to be in her dissertation. So I'm just going to present a piece of it because she'll have some amazing findings probably in like a year or two that she'll be able to share. And then Dr. Rebecca Dudensing, she's in AgriLife Extension. So we're trying to add in some of the agricultural loss and agricultural businesses in this as well, but I'm not going to really be talking about that. Okay, so a little bit more about these communities. So Beaumont, Texas, Port Arthur, Texas. I briefly thought about going back to our Hurricane Laura picture, but I won't do that to you guys. So they're kind of on the southeast portion, right on the border basically of Texas and Louisiana. Port Arthur is a very industrial town. All these communities have a very diverse population. Beaumont is a little bit larger than the other two. Beaumont's got a population of around 120,000, mostly, yes, business population, 10,000, 35% non-Hispanic white, 47% non-Hispanic Black, 13% Hispanic in Beaumont. Kind of, I don't know, similar distributions in Port Arthur and Lake Charles. And so we wanted to pick these communities in particular so that we could test this idea of differences between recoveries in minority-owned businesses, minority-owned neighborhoods. So there was differences in the impact between Harvey, the pandemic, and Laura, because we wanted to see whether a minor impact from maybe a later event like Hurricane Laura might still be a really severe impact because of these vulnerability factors and this kind of, exacerbation of some of these previous impacts. So that's kind of why we picked these. And at the time, there was a lot of questions coming out about how the pandemic was affecting small businesses and minority-owned businesses. So I've been talking about, the hazards, but it's also in the middle of the pandemic and really early on in the pandemic. I think maybe we all don't want to remember early 2020, but it was early 2020. And yeah, a lot of these kind of articles were coming out. So, we saw that minority-owned businesses were closing at a much higher rate in the pandemic, much less, the ones affected by disasters. PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, another SBA product, became quite a debate for a time. And so they changed their process from kind of what I've been talking about with the kind of normal hurricane disaster process. And they ended up going through local banks. And so that kind of, they thought it was going to be probably a good idea because it would be faster assistance, and there is some reason to want to prioritize speed. But what ended up happening was there was a ton of competition. Maybe you guys remember this, but there was a ton of competition. Businesses or people that ended up having prior bank relationships were able to get their applications in and kind of get the money before everyone else. And we know that can have some equity implications as well, because we know that, first of all, there's a lot of history of discrimination in the banking industry in terms of race. And even still, minority businesses themselves still have unequal banking outcomes, even though it's been tried to be addressed in the last couple decades, but still unequal banking outcomes, subject to higher borrowing costs, smaller loans, and higher loan rejections. So kind of this idea, thinking back to our lens of, perhaps a difference in the level of resource access to begin with, leading to a potential level of resource access after a disaster like the pandemic, for example. So kind of given this context and given what we know, we had 3-ish hypotheses, and I'll only talk about like 1 or 2. But we thought that the idea was disasters exacerbate pre-existing trends. And so we figured that kind of disparate recoveries for minority organizations from a prior hazard will compound the impact of a secondary hazard. We also knew that business assistance is based on economic performance, kind of based on this previous research, which we argued is unequal across owner and manager demographics. And so given that the pandemic assistance was dispersed through banks, which has historically excluded minority populations and minority-owned businesses, we expect that they will receive less funding and therefore, fare worse, all things considered. The last one, so we expect that minority-owned and managed businesses are less likely to receive assistance controlling for damage. And the last one is about nonprofits, but again, I won't talk about nonprofits. Okay, so kind of a plug for Design Safe. So if you're in the disaster space, you've probably heard about Design Safe, but one of the best ways that we can not be surprised by the same thing over and over and over again with disasters, we think of them as maybe once in a lifetime events, but really, they're happening over and over and over again. And the best way that we can start learning from them and start making changes is by sharing our research with other researchers and other folks that are doing this work. So Design Safe is an open access repository for disaster specific data. If you don't want to publish data, you can also publish survey instruments. So the survey that I'm talking about right now is up on Design Safe. This is kind of the page that you can see. So you can download the instrument. It's got the paper version, it's got the Qualtrics version. If anyone wanted to modify it or change it in some way, we'll eventually put the data up there once Joy is done with her dissertation, most likely. And so that way we can, start pooling data, learning across different events, seeing if we see the same things in other types of events. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to put Design Safe up here because if you do want to see what the survey looked like for this research, it is available. Okay, so because this is still preliminary results, and I wanted to talk about it today with you because it is ongoing and it is sort of this kind of spatial method that we've been working on with this. So I am going to do, fairly descriptive things for this piece. We're going to do tacit proportions, descriptive statistics, just preliminary results because I mostly just want to meet you guys and talk to you. So it's just an excuse for me to do that. And so this is our sample of the businesses. We did a stratified random sample within Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Lake Charles. So we stratified in Beaumont and Port Arthur based on whether they were in the floodplain or not in the floodplain, based on sector. That's been done in business research in the past. But then in Lake Charles, because it was not flooding based, it was wind based. We just did a stratified sample with the business sector. And so we saw, a lot of range in terms of, which events businesses were subject to. A lot of Harvey, a lot of Laura, and a lot of combinations, whether it was Laura Delta. Usually in the Lake Charles case, it was Laura Delta. Harvey Laura was generally kind of in the Beaumont Port Arthur case. Some had all of them, and some had none of them, which, we need those types of businesses for our control. We had 16% racial or ethnic minority businesses, 45% were kind of these small single owner businesses. A little bit less than half were renters. pretty old businesses in our sample. I was pretty surprised. 29 years average age of business, which is very old for businesses. There's a lot of turnover. And about a medium size, so 15 employees. We had more from Beaumont. You know, Beaumont is larger than Port Arthur. Port Arthur is a little bit smaller. And then Lake Charles is kind of our second largest here. Damage-wise, anywhere from, you know, minor to moderate, average around moderate-ish for Laura, and maybe a little bit more on the minor side for Delta and Harvey. Businesses closed for an average of 5 days with Harvey, 5 days with Delta, 3 weeks, 21 days for Laura. And then with the pandemic, the pandemic was very challenging to try to put in a survey. I would love to hear your thoughts on this if you tried to do this, but it's, you know, it's a long time frame. There's a lot of different things that could have happened in that time frame. So this is the best that we came up with. Whether they experienced any of these impacts within the first 12 months, which was, you know, the time frame that we were looking at. And then we did do actually a little kind of mapping exercise where they put which month they experienced all these things. But just for the sake of this, you know, this is just kind of a snapshot of what those impacts were. So most, of course, lost revenue at some point, lost customers. Some did better. You know, we know that there are, you know, winners and losers after disasters, and some did better with revenue, probably toilet paper companies, I would imagine. So there were some with some of these positive outcomes too, which, yeah, we're happy to see that variety. Huh?
Roofers.
Exactly. Yeah, roofers. Yeah, we did have those in our sample. They were very happy. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what do we find in terms of assistance in the pandemic? So I'm just going to show a few differences between the minority-owned businesses and the non-minority-owned businesses. So we thought that there might be a relationship between having a previous bank loan and whether they were able to get disaster assistance from the pandemic. We didn't find a significant difference. It was close, but no significant difference in previous bank loan. But we did find significant differences in outcomes in terms of resource access. So minority businesses and non-minority owned businesses applied for assistance. You know, no significant difference between their application for assistance, but we did see significant differences in whether they were approved for assistance. So minority owned businesses were less likely to receive pandemic assistance once they applied. And that was any assistance. So it includes SBA, but also includes, you know, there were a lot of, you know, programs that came out with the pandemic, which actually made the research a little bit easier, because usually it's like 1 out of 10 businesses get an assistance. It's very tough to actually find that effect. But, you know, the pandemic assistance had a lot of state assistance, had a lot of local assistance. So this was any, but also when we look specifically into this more debt-based or SBA type assistance, pandemic-related SBA assistance also primarily went to non-minority owned businesses compared to minority businesses when we look at the applications. And Laura and Delta, it's kind of interesting because this happened. So pandemic was in March, Laura and Delta happened in like the fall, like late summer, fall of that same year. And so now, instead of seeing a non-significant difference between applications, we're actually seeing significant differences between minority and non-minority businesses in the application. So it's possible, and this is just me speculating, so take that with a grain of salt, that, you know, it's possible that businesses attempted to apply for PPP or maybe even receive PPP and didn't want to get that experience again. They didn't want to maybe get additional debt, but we do see differences in the level of applications for Laura and Delta. And we also see the same disparity in between who's receiving assistance between minority and non-minority businesses. Non-minority businesses are much more likely to be approved compared to minority-owned businesses. And this is kind of the interesting piece, I think. So we really wanted to know what this geography looks like with this market area, with the supplier area, and what, you know, minority-owned businesses were basically serving. So we asked, it's kind of small, but we asked the spatial extent of the market. So we asked, how would you generally describe the scope of the market after and before the pandemic and Hurricane Laura? Are you primarily serving the neighborhood, the city, Southwest Louisiana, the US, or other countries? So they were able to kind of do their scale bar of where they saw most of their market coming from, or how they're kind of targeting their market. And we saw actually that minority businesses were much more likely to serve their neighborhood rather than a larger market area, which non-minority businesses were serving. We didn't see differences in supplier locations, but definitely with the market area. And so we asked that question because we want to know if that business outcome, this disparity in business outcome, either because of resources or because of any of the other impacts that businesses have, is that affecting minority-owned neighborhoods or non-minority neighborhoods? And so we can look at it spatially. We can look at the census data. We can see what does the composition of that market. Now that we know it's the neighborhood, and yes, neighborhood's not a very direct scale, but it's the best we could do. We couldn't have them draw a circle. They were already annoyed that we were asking them so many questions to begin with. So we just said, okay, why don't we just ask? What sorts of demographics does this business serve? So we asked before the pandemic and after the pandemic, and before Laura and after Laura, we asked a series. Do you primarily serve mostly non-Hispanic white customers? Do you serve a mix? Or do you serve primarily non-Hispanic, Black, Hispanic, or other racial races and ethnicities? And we also found that minority businesses had a much higher proportion serving racial and ethnic minority customers compared to non-minority businesses. So they're serving local areas, and they're also serving racial and minority and ethnic neighborhoods. So to bring us back to the equity question, what does equity have to do with businesses? We do see that business ownership and kind of that social vulnerabilities perspective does apply to business ownership in terms of long-term outcomes, that 15-month outcome after Hurricane Matthew and Florence in North Carolina. We see that minority ownership has to do with ability to access resources. We saw that minority-owned businesses are less likely to be approved for assistance, even when applying at the same rate as non-minority businesses. And we also see that in terms of overall community recovery, that's going to have an effect. If we're having this kind of disparate effect on minority-owned businesses, we're also in turn having an effect on minority neighborhoods and racial minority neighborhoods and ethnic neighborhoods, because those are the neighborhoods, either the small local areas or the demographics of the clients that these particular businesses are serving. And so inequalities in business recovery can have repercussions for underserved communities and households. And so thinking all the way back to, why is SBA thinking about equity? How should they be thinking about equity? Maybe there is some justification for more targeted assistance programs based on, business ownership type, because if they're interested in, increasing access to resources in underserved communities, serving, minority-owned businesses or underserved community-owned businesses is a way to not only help the business itself, but also help the neighborhood that business is serving. So access to those services, access to those goods, who has access to what type of businesses are coming back, what types of businesses do we want to come back? All of these things are important to us socially, in addition to economically. And yeah, that's what I have. Hey.
I love to be forced to eat that. When someone says, you gotta have a female. So, right? Did I say that? Right?
I hope I get a check on that one for the evaluation.
Yeah, analysis, of course, it's an important technique to know. But my question is, I guess, in the post-disaster relief scenarios, what about the insurance companies? And I didn't see a whole lot discussed about that. Was there any disparities in how they reacted in terms of the communities? And initially, there may be some disparity in terms of coverage as well that may have, slowed recovery in certain areas. Do you have any data or any idea of what's going on with the insurance, the response of the insurance company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy and also not happy that you asked about it. Yeah, because it's really hard to look at insurance because it's just so infrequent with the business sample. Like, that's why I ended up aggregating across any form of assistance. And actually, so insurance is technically in that group of any type of assistance. So we included interruption assistance for the pandemic, and then building and contents and interruption for the disaster, Laura and Delta disasters. But yeah, it's just so few had them, that it was almost impossible to find the effect, because it was just, but it also happened, I don't want to say that too, matter of factly, because also what happened was, we would go into a place like a Publix or a McDonald's, and they're like, who we would talk to, we're not talking to the CEO of McDonald's, we're talking to the manager, and they're like, I'm pretty sure we have assistance. So we marked down whether they had insurance. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get that assistance information because it's either the manager that doesn't know, or a manager that doesn't want to tell us, or it's the small businesses that would like to tell us because they would love to tell us about how, the insurance process. Like, we definitely have anecdotes about how the insurance process was very challenging. And especially actually with the interruption insurance, like there was so much debate about whether the pandemic would even count for business interruption. And it ended up being that even businesses that had business interruption insurance, they're like, well, the pandemic doesn't count. So they didn't get it anyway. So they wanted to tell us, but they didn't have the coverage as much. So it was very tough. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer.
I enjoyed hearing about the damage to customers and customer base. But I was wondering about the homeowner or the business owners themselves, whether they might themselves live in, say, substandard housing. Because if your business is damaged more than average and your home is more than average, thoughts on that? Is that definitely true, or?
Well, that's a great, that's, we were thinking about it, but we had trouble figuring out how to put that in the survey. We did ask that in interviews. And so we definitely found that to be the case and especially, it's that, so the physical damage, and then also with the pandemic, it ended up being a childcare issue also. So, people, like, women-owned businesses, this was more of the racial minority, but we also looked at women-owned businesses, and they had a more of a home influence, like you're saying, kind of on the other side, the ownership home pull from the childcare side. But definitely having to take care of the home. And then also, if your home is damaged, it's less collateral to apply for assistance. And then, they were, not wanting to additionally have that debt burden because it's now not just the business damage, but the home damage as well. So hopefully we just have that in the interviews, but definitely a good part.
I have a question for you. So you spoke about the size of these businesses. Did you also consider if they were part of a chain? I'm thinking, for example, like McDonald's is probably going to have all kinds of support from the actual company versus a mom and pop shop.
And actually that was one that I didn't pull out of the SBA analysis from Galveston, but corporations ended up, they were approved for more money, but they just didn't take it because they were the ones that had insurance. So we looked at that because maybe the franchise adds in additional insurance, but we didn't put it in the Laura one yet because we're still kind of primarily do it. But that's excellent point, because definitely the corporations have more.
Quick question about the finding from kind of the first half of the talk when you had the regression models, and there was an effect of businesses that move are more likely to recover in a better way. Do you have any more data on that, or is there more context you can put around it, like how far distance are we talking in the move, or what was the definition of moving?
So I didn't put it in here, but I did look at that, and actually that effect holds only for if they moved completely outside their original city. So if they moved within their original city, it was not significant, but if they moved totally outside, it was significant. So the worst thing to see as an urban planner. But for a business, probably a smart move. But that's another thing too that we could add into the spatial piece, but it's not sure how to track them.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's give her another round of applause.